We are continuing our series today called The Hope Within. And if you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, we've been walking through coming out of our Celebrate New Life series. Thank you, Hayden. Just talking about what does it look like to share the hope that we have within, right? If you're sitting here today and you would call yourself a follower of Jesus, then we all are on this mission, like our church's mission, to transform the East Bay and beyond with the gospel of Jesus. And over the last couple of weeks, this series has been breaking down what does that actually look like? And it started out 2 weeks ago with Danny talking about it. It begins with us having this fear and this reverence of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah says he is undone in the presence of God, and then the gospel touches his life, and then he says, "Here I am, Lord, send me. Would I be a vessel?" And then last week, if you were with us, Danny talked about what does it look like to not ask God, hey, how do I get involved in the work that you're doing, but really to simply invite Jesus, hey, would you come to my workplace? That whether you're an accountant or a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a stay-at-home mom or retired, in your sphere of influence, that God has placed you in, what does it look like to very simply say, God, would you be with me this week on a Monday afternoon, on a Thursday morning? What does it look like to share our faith and to continue to have a reason for the hope that we have? And today we continue in this series with your note sheet there. It says ordinary questions, extraordinary opportunity. And what I want to unpack today is what does it look like for you and I to find ourselves in a spot where we can actually share our faith. And now, if you're anything like me, that can be terrifying, right? I found myself on a vacation a couple weeks ago celebrating my anniversary, and I was sitting poolside with a couple, and we were just chatting, and they had talked about their lives, and then they turned to us, and they say, what about you? What are you doing? Or what do you do? And that's always a funny moment for me because I say, I'm a pastor. And I watch them kind of hide their margarita behind their back, right? And go like, oh, interesting. And it's a challenging moment. And maybe it's different for you, right? Maybe it's not because you're a pastor, but maybe the conversation comes up that you're a Christian or that you go to church and you watch the tone change, you watch the conversation change, and sharing your faith can be something that's scary. Right? We can feel like we run into moments where we don't have the perfect words, where we might not have all the theological answers, that we're afraid of messing it up. Or maybe this one, right? You feel responsible in this conversation could change somebody's eternity. And if I mess it up, their eternal destiny could be on my shoulders. And what I want to invite us into is maybe seeing this from a different angle today to understand what we're being invited into, and something in our life that can change the way that we live our life into something we are, not necessarily just these opportunities that we're looking for, not necessarily something we do, but God inviting us into something that we actually are. I'm a big fan of like great moments in movies or incredible speeches in history, right? If you've seen Braveheart, the movie, I was recapping, anybody seen the movie Braveheart in here? Okay, I'm not condoning it from stage by any way, shape, or form, so parents don't get me in trouble for anything, but there's this great moment in that movie where William Wallace is riding up and down a very fearful Scottish army, and he gives this incredible speech. Right? And he says, "Sons of Scotland." Right? I have the worst Scottish accent, so don't cancel me. But if you're Scottish, I'm sorry. But he looks at them and he says, "They may take your lives, but they'll never take your freedom." Right? I thought about painting half my face blue for the sake of this sermon, but then I realized I'd have to preach the rest of the sermon with it. Right? There's a great moment in the Toy Story movies relevant to the Bay Area, right? The first fully animated film to come out of Pixar Studios back in the 90s. And there's this incredible moment, Toy Story 1, where Buzz is just feeling dejected. He realized that he's not a space ranger. He's just a toy. And then Woody gives him this riveting speech, right? He goes, "Just a toy? You're not just a toy, you're a Buzz Lightyear." He's like, "Your helmet does that whoosh thing." Right? He's like, "You're Andy's toy. Any toy would kill. They would give their parts to be a Buzz Lightyear." And Buzz has this moment where he's filled up, right? He's juiced up, and he goes and he helps Woody escape from Sid's backyard. And there's these great moments in either cinematic history or in history itself of these riveting speeches that then ask, what do we do on the other side of it? One of my favorite ones is Matthew chapter 28, a resurrected Jesus, right? Which that sentence alone, a man that came, lived a life perfectly, and then was crucified, killed, and then 3 days later resurrects himself from the dead. All of Christianity hinges on that historical moment. And then he gathers his 11 guys on a mountainside. And I kind of imagine this is a moment where those 11 guys are like fired up. And Jesus is like, all right, y'all, we're going to go make disciples of all nations. And they're like, okay, make disciples of, what, do you say all nations? They're like 1, 2, 3. Like, Jesus, there's 11 of us. And he goes, how are we going to do that? And he goes, you're going to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You're going to teach them to observe all that I've commanded you, and then I'm going to be with you. And there's this moment where the 11 disciples have to decide, are we in or not? Are we going to respond to this call that Jesus is inviting us into? And I love in Acts chapter 1, it says that the disciples are kind of caught just staring into the sky as Jesus ascends, right? Jesus gives them this like rally battle cry and then just disappears. Just goes back into heaven, and the disciples are like, and then the angels show up and they're like, what are you doing? They're like, go. Like he gave you a job, go and make disciples, and he's inviting them into this lifestyle that now 2,000 years later, we have the same question of what does that look like for you and what does that look like for me? I was at a Giants-Mariners game not too long ago, and my dad and I are waiting in line, and there was a guy, as the line snaked, there was a guy just standing there with a big sign and a bullhorn, right? Maybe you've seen this before. Right? And there was a bunch of passages from Revelation on this sign, and he was just bullhorn yelling, repent or you'll burn in the lake of fire. And I wanted to walk up to this guy and not condemn him, but just genuinely ask, like, hey, is this working? Like, is this winsome? Like, how many conversations have you had with people where there's been like an effective, winsome conversation? And maybe there has. I didn't ask him. But I look at that and I go like, ooh, I don't know if that's the Matthew 28 call that we're supposed to respond to. But then maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum, Pastor AJ and I talk about this in our podcast this week. I would encourage you to check it out. But we talk about this quote from Francis of Assisi, which actually wasn't Francis of Assisi at all. But the quote goes something like this: preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. And we see it on this side, and I look at that and I go like, ooh, I don't know about that either. Right? The gospel is inherently words. Nobody has ever helped somebody across the street with their groceries, and then that person has turned around and been like, maybe there was a Jewish carpenter 2,000 years ago that came and lived a perfect life, right? Like the gospel is words. And so I don't know if it's the sign and the bullhorn in the Revelation passages or the preach the gospel at all times when necessary use words. Like both of those feel like we're missing it. And today I don't want to talk about a middle ground. I'm not looking for compromise. What I want to talk about is like the real ground that we actually stand on 2,000 years later as we respond to Matthew 28 and this great commission to go and to make disciples. And it can be scary, but what I want us to take a step towards as a church is not to say like, okay, I'm going to be an evangelist now, but to say, I want to grow in sharing my faith. And I feel like that's something we can all commit to, that we can walk out those doors and we say, I want to grow. I want to increase my ability to share my faith. And so today I want to give us a tool to put in our tool belt as we learn what it looks like to be a church that goes out into our spheres of influence and continues to share the hope that we have within. Okay, so if you have a Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 4. You can read it on the screens behind me. But I love this passage, and as we read this passage, here's the lens through which I want us to see this passage. Sharing your faith isn't about a perfect technique. It's about faithful presence and trusting God with the results. Now in Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29 says this. He also said, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows. Though he does not know how, all by itself the soil produces grain, first the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. This is the word of the Lord. And what I want us to see in this passage as we talk about this sharing your faith isn't about this perfect technique, is that really three things I see in this passage that I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking. Number one, on your note sheets, your first fill in the blank, that we are called to live compelling lives. That you and I, If we want to share the reason for the hope that we have within, it has to start with us, first and foremost, living compelling lives. Right? There is something to the Francis of Assisi quote that says, preach the gospel at all times with your actions. Right? We do need to be people that back up our words with the actual lives that we are living. We must live compelling lives. Number two, right? We need to be people that cultivate curiosity. Cultivate curiosity. Over the last 2 weeks, I've spent some time, for whatever reason, leading up to this sermon with farmers and ranchers. And my brother-in-law, I was just in Washington this last week. My brother-in-law is a big potato farmer up there. And then I have dear friends in the Central Valley that are stone fruit farmers, think like an apricot or a pluot. And in both of my conversations with these farmers, two things that struck me. Number one was that they said, we're all in all the time. To be a farmer, you don't really clock in and clock out. To be a farmer, they say we're all in every year, all the time. It's more of something we are than it is something we do. You can't really choose to clock out if the crop needs you or if the harvest needs you. There's something to being a farmer that's more of a lifestyle than it is a job. And that was fascinating in my conversations with them. But the second thing was this, that even the best farmers in the world cannot grow crops. The best farmers in the world, you can't walk out to a field and manifest a crop, right? The best farmers in the world, what they do is they cultivate environments in which crops grow. And they're not half-hearted about it. They go all in all the time every year to create the best possible environment in which that crop can grow. And for us, as we respond to this, I see those exact two things in our life. What does it look like for you and I to be all in all the time? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you sit on an airplane and within 3 minutes you get to Romans chapter 3. But I do think it means that we pay attention to what God is up to in our lives. We live compelling lives and then we cultivate curiosity. We create environments in which these types of conversations can flow easily. And then lastly, we trust the Spirit to bring the harvest. That we realize we absolutely have a job to do, but we also recognize that God is up to something, that he is moving and we are invited into that movement. So number one, on your note sheet there, it says live compelling lives. I love how Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 puts it. It says this, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Right? We hear how winsome this language is, living wisely, discerning when to have conversation, when not to have conversation, with grace. Right? There's almost this elegance to the conversation, seasoned with salt. You ever cooked something and then put way too much salt in? And then you take that first bite and you're like, oh, it's like an assault to your mouth, right? There's something about that moment where you just go my taste buds are on fire right now. Sometimes these conversations can be this way. They're like the bullhorn conversations. And Paul to the church of Colossae goes make sure that conversation is seasoned with salt, that you're walking into it wisely, discerning, graciously. And so how do we live compelling lives? On your note sheet there, the first fill in the blank under live compelling lives says live differently. Right? Not perfectly, but authentically and humbly. That you and I are called to live in this world, not of this world, and live differently. That there should be something different about your life than the lives of people around you that would not call themselves followers of Jesus. Right? We are called to live differently. Number two, we are called to practice the ministry of presence. Right? Show up consistently in real relationships. I had a friend share with me that she was going to Starbucks consistently. And one time she recognized that these baristas, they have, dozens, if not hundreds of interactions on a daily basis. And they're always, smiling and kind of have this warm disposition. And she paused and she asked the barista, she said, hey, how do you know that a customer actually cares about you as the barista and isn't just having a transactional moment? And the barista paused and she goes, man, that's such a good question. She said, honestly, it's the people that I see consistently that ask me a question and then 2 days later or a week later, whenever it is that they come in for their coffee, right? Some of us, it's a few hours later. It's when they come back in, they follow up on the question that they asked. I was oh man, how simple is that? That we are called to be people that practice the ministry of presence, that we show up consistently in real relationships, even in a coffee transaction, that you can show up in that moment and practice a ministry of presence. Right? Which leads to the third point, which is we build relational bridges, that we demonstrate genuine care, not an agenda. Right? At Three Crosses, we talk about this all the time, that relationships are the bridge that truth travels over. It's our philosophy in our life groups. It's our philosophy in Regen. It's our philosophy in our junior high and our high school ministries and our young adults ministries. Right? We are people that want to build relational bridges. And one of my kind of the things that I struggle with the bullhorn preacher is that there's not a lot of bridge between the person preaching and the audience. And so we want to be a people that go like, hey, all the people that I listen to in my life are people that have done the hard work, that are present, that are consistent, and that have built that relational bridge. So by the time they want to tell me truth, I'm more willing to listen because I know you don't have an agenda. I know there's relationship here. And lastly, under living compelling lives, it says stick around so that when they're ready to ask questions, you're there. I have relationships in my life of friends that I've been friends with for years. And every time we interact, it doesn't mean that we're having some deep level spiritual conversation. And yet what I've loved about these years-long relationships is I've stuck around long enough that when that conversation does circle back, I'm here for it. And I want to be present. I've done the hard work to build that bridge so that when that conversation comes up, right, I'm ready to talk. I'm ready to be there. I'm ready to maybe answer that question or say, I don't know. That's such a good question. Let's wrestle with it together. We are called as a people to live compelling lives. Right? The second part on that note sheet there, it says cultivate curiosity. Cultivate curiosity. Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 27, those first two verses that we read, let me just read them again. It says, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground night and day. Whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. Right? There's this night and day cultivation that's happening, whether you get up or lay down. It's this ongoing creating an environment with the relationships around you to spread that seed. Right? And as we cultivate curiosity, here's what I think that looks like. When I was about 20 years old, I was working at a camp called Hume Lake Christian Camps, and I was in their junior high camp, and I was working for a guy named Derek. And I walked through a bunch of life with Derek that summer, and there was one particular moment where I was going on a date. It was like a first date with a girl. And as I was going on this date, he looked at me and he said, hey, one piece of advice. He said, interested people are interesting people. Interested people are interesting people. And then he just walked away. I was like, huh? It was like some Yoda business there. Like, what do you mean? And what he meant was this, that I interact with people all the time that are trying to be interesting, right? I fall guilty of this all the time. I'm in a new environment. I sit in that new environment and I want to be interesting. I want to have something to contribute. But Derek's point was that interested people are oftentimes the most interesting people. When somebody sits down and asks you a good question, looks you in the eye, asks you a follow-up question, there's something compelling about that they're creating this moment, this environment, this conversation that makes you feel more comfortable. And I wonder how well we would do to adopt this mentality when it comes into sharing our faith. A lot of what Pastor AJ and I talk about in the podcast that drops tomorrow is this book called Tactics by Greg Koukl. And in this book, Greg talks about 3 Columbo questions. And he's referencing Lieutenant Columbo. Anybody know that reference in the house? Okay. It's probably the same people. Did you all see this shirt? This is the original 3 Crosses on the back there, 3 Crosses Young Adults. The same people that know who Lieutenant Columbo are probably the people that attended this 3 Crosses, not this 3 Crosses, okay? But Lieutenant Columbo, he was kind of famous in the late 60s all the way up to about 2003 is when the last episode aired. But he wasn't a particularly smart detective. There was nothing about him that was flashy, and yet he always got the job done. And a big part of his methodology was just asking simple questions at the right time and the right moment to better understand the situation. And so Greg Koukl adopts this mindset, and he calls these the 3 Columbo questions. But on your note sheet, the first Columbo question is this: what do you mean by that? That what we're trying to do is gather more information to understand what somebody believes before responding. Right? Oftentimes, like, you and I can get into these moments, or what we fear is getting into this like heated debate moment. Right? And let me say sidebar caveat, tone is everything. Right? If you walk into one of these conversations and you go, what do you mean by that? It's not gonna go well for you. Okay? I had to learn this one the hard way. I grew up in the Payne household where around my dinner table, right, like heated debate and passion is just love language. Right? One of the first times my wife sat down at our dinner table with the Payne family, she was like, why are you all so angry at each other? And I'm like, angry? Right? We're just talking about the day. That's just our way. And yet, when it comes to these Columbo questions, tone is everything. Hey, what do you mean by that? Hey, help me understand. You might have somebody use the word God or love or truth. They might say, I don't really believe in religion, I just believe in love. And a great follow-up question to that is, hey, what do you mean by love? Hey, can we just ask better questions to say, what do you mean by that, to gather more information before we respond? Right? The second Columbo question is this: how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? Invite them to share their story and their reasoning. You might hear a statement that says all religions are basically the same thing. You ever heard that one before? All religions are just the same. And a great follow-up question, instead of entering into a moment of debate, right, instead of entering into a moment of confrontation, what does it look like to have a posture of invitation? And just to simply ask the question, hey, how did you come to that conclusion? Right? You might take the burden of proof, and instead of you feeling the full burden of proof of I have to defend Christianity, this is a great way of just gently, respectfully putting the burden of proof back on them. To go, hey, how did you come to that conclusion that all religions are basically the same thing? And then listen, nod along, right? With wisdom, seasoned with salt, with grace. What does it look like to ask better questions? And lastly, the last Columbo question is, have you ever considered? Have you ever considered? And this is where you and I can gently introduce a new perspective. Right? Greg Koukl in his book, he says, if we do these questions well, if we put these into practice well, what we do is we actually put a stone in the shoe of the other person without being aggressive or manipulative. And when I first heard that, I was like, putting a stone in someone's shoe sounds terrible, right? And yet there's something to that. Hey, I'm not trying to be aggressive, I'm not trying to be manipulative, but if somebody walks away with a stone in their shoe and they're kind of like left, they can't ignore it. They have to do something about that question. Hey, have you ever considered? Hey, how'd you come to that conclusion? Can you help me understand? You just ask better questions, to be invitational, not confrontational. Why does this matter? Hey, 3 reasons why this matters. Number 1, curiosity disarms defenses. Curiosity disarms defenses. Oftentimes we get into these conversations and they put up a defense and then you put up a defense, and all of a sudden you find yourself, right? Maybe you asked question 1 really well and you were like, hey, what do you mean by that? And then you ask question number 2 a little bit aggressively and you're like, hey, how'd you come to that conclusion? And then you're like, hey, have you ever considered? As they walk away, and you're like, I tried the Columbo questions. But I wonder what it looks like for us to cultivate this curiosity that disarms defensiveness, that we remove the feeling of defensiveness and we help them remove the feeling of defensiveness, and we just get to enter into a conversation a little bit more winsomely. Right? Curiosity honors the other person. If you enter into a conversation that you've built a relational bridge on, that you've stuck around long enough, you can honor the other person by genuinely listening. Asking questions not to get your agenda across, not waiting for your turn to talk, but real, actually caring about what they have to say. And I want to honor you. I want to be curious about how you came to the conclusions that you did. And lastly, curiosity creates safe God space where people can wrestle without pressure. Right? We're not looking to bring somebody to just cross this line in the sand. We're looking to cultivate curious environments in which God can move. God can do what only God can do, which leads us to the last point. Right? Can we trust the Spirit to bring the harvest? Now, the title of this sermon is all about ordinary questions and these extraordinary moments. Right? And so the weight of your entire note sheet is on that middle section of us doing a better job of cultivating curious environments around us. And yet, points 1 and 3, without them, point 2 doesn't matter. Right? If you're not living a compelling life, then asking the right questions will never help. Right? If we don't believe the very thing that we're trying to create environments to talk about, if that truth isn't first and foremost taking deep roots in our life, then we can't ask those questions winsomely in anybody else's life. And lastly, right, you and I could ask the best questions in the world, and we could live a compelling life, but there's a certain aspect of this that is a mystery. Right? Listen again to the way that Mark puts it. In verse 28 of chapter 4, he says, all by itself the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. Hey, there's an aspect of this that is absolutely a mystery, that we sow the seed and then God moves in a way that only God can move. And this is oftentimes where I think a lot of us freeze. Right? We might ask the question, what if I don't have the perfect doctrine? Right? What if I get to the end of my Columbo questions and I can't answer the question that they ask me? Right? Or maybe worst of all, what if they reject me? And you enter into one of these conversations and you go, I hate this feeling. I got rejected again. And I wonder if we look at our job versus God's job, how much this frees us up to enter into these spaces and live differently rather than looking for these moments to do the right thing. Right? And so our job, we've been talking about it all morning, but our job is to live compellingly, it says on your note sheet, to cultivate curiosity, and then to scatter seeds of hope. Mark 4 says, you day and night, as you rise, as you get up, like, we're just out there scattering. That's our job. But God's job is this. God's job, number one, is to grow the seed. If you've been around following Jesus for even months or years and you've had an opportunity to share your faith, right, there's this moment where somebody is open to God moving in their lives that is an absolute miracle and mystery. Right? I've been a pastor for 10 years. I've been working predominantly in youth ministry, and it never ceases to amaze me to watch somebody's heart change and for the seed to grow in a way that's an absolute mystery to me. Right? Sometimes it's students that I've honestly, frankly, given up on. And I'm like, that student's just, there's no way. Like, they're not getting it. And they're showing up, and I don't know why they're showing up. And then all of a sudden, this seed starts to grow in their life. And I'm like, really, Lord? Them? Right? Some of my students are sitting in the balcony, and they're like, is he talking about me? Maybe, okay? But it never ceases to amaze me to watch this miracle happen where we might sow the seed and do our job, but then God grows that seed. Secondly, it says that God changes the heart. That I love in Ezekiel, it says that God, you will trade out a heart of stone for a heart of flesh. That the scales can fall off someone's eyes and their heart can soften and be open to the good news of the gospel in a way that only the Spirit of God can do. Right? Scripture says that the gospel is foolishness to those that don't believe. But for those of us that do believe, it's life. Right? It's the real that we stand on, and to watch us, our role to scatter seed, and then see God do what only God can do. When you watch someone's heart change, it's nothing short of a miracle. It says all by itself, right? The seed grows, and then God comes in, and lastly, God brings the harvest. God grows the seed, he changes the heart, and he brings the harvest. And yet there's an invitation in there for us as well. That Matthew chapter 9 says, the harvest that God is bringing is plentiful, but the workers are what? Few. And I love this series because starting out in Isaiah chapter 6, in a posture of worship, God then says, who will go for me? And Isaiah's response is, here I am, Lord, send me. And I wonder what it would look like for us even this week to respond and say, God, I want to grow in sharing my faith. I want to be all in all the time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I walk out tomorrow into my neighborhood and I grab a bullhorn and a sign, but it does mean that I take steps towards growing and learning what it looks like to live a compelling life, to cultivate curiosity, and then to trust God to do what only God can do. But here's an encouragement for us as a church just as we close this morning. I was reading a book recently where the main character of the book is talking about his entrepreneurial journey. And he said in his young 20s, he was selling encyclopedias door to door. And he said, I was terrible at it. And a part of why I was terrible about it is because nobody really wanted an encyclopedia, first of all. And second of all, I didn't really believe in what I was selling. He said by the 100th door he knocks on the door and goes, "You want to buy an encyclopedia?" Nobody's buying that encyclopedia. And I think sometimes we buy into the lie that Christianity is on the decline and that we're selling an old encyclopedia. And yet, friends, right, it couldn't be less true that that's what we're selling. Right? We are in a day and age, friends, where this is not the decline of Christianity. I read this recently that post-Christian always means pre-revival. Right? And in the Bay Area right now, we're seeing nothing short of revival. Right? That people are flocking back to church and there's an openness to truth. And the cool part is that God is moving, that the Spirit is working, and that He's inviting you and I to join Him. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. What would it look like for us as Three Crosses to go out into the East Bay and say, God, this week, I want to be a part of what you're already doing in the Bay Area? That people are open to having these types of conversation. Are you living a life that's compelling? Are you willing to cultivate curiosity around you? And then can we release and trust God and go, your Spirit is moving. My job is to sow the seed. Your job is to bring the harvest. Okay, pray with me. God, man, as we open up these passages, we read about the mystery of you moving, of you growing these seeds. God, I pray that we would be a church that's faithful, that we would be a church that from the inside out, personally, individually, we are being transformed by the good news of the gospel. And then, God, we can't help but then live a life that glorifies you, that responds to the mission of the Great Commission to go and to make disciples. God, help us be all in all the time. But God, help us to understand what that means. That we are to step into a lifestyle in our workplaces, in our families, in our neighborhoods, seasoned with salt, filled to the brim with grace, invitationally asking better questions, living on mission, God, so that we can watch your kingdom grow. God, thank you for the ways that you're already doing that. God, that we think 2 weeks ago of the 49 people baptized here. God, we think about life groups kicking off. We see just the way that you're moving at Three Crosses and beyond, and we just thank you. We pause and we give you gratitude for that. God, and we ask that you would open up our eyes this week to see, open up our ears this week to hear just the opportunities that you're putting in front of us. Open up those doors. And then give us courage to continue to grow in our understanding of what it means to share our faith. We love you, God. Thanks for loving us first. In your name we pray.